Imagine giving away the last thing you have left, not knowing it will change your life forever. A cold night, a simple gesture, and an unexpected encounter with a woman who could rewrite his fate. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about kindness and redemption. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe the twist. The cold in Chicago had a way of cutting deeper than any other place. It was the kind of chill that seeped into your bones, making the world feel even colder than it already was. The snow that fell in soft, relentless sheets only made things worse. It was a late evening in December, the kind of night where the city's usual hum seemed to be muted under the weight of winter. The usual clamor of taxis and pedestrians was replaced by an eerie quiet, as if the snow had blanketed not just the streets but the very rhythm of the city itself. John Matthews stood at the bus stop on 56th and Madison, his back hunched against the wind, clutching a tattered manila folder filled with the remnants of his failed dreams. The folder wasn't a collection of inspiration or hope, it was a map of rejection, the pieces of his former life that had disintegrated in his hands. Inside were 5 resumes, each one a promise that went unanswered, each one a quiet death, of a career that had once felt secure, once felt like it was meant for something grand. John had been an architect once. He had built homes, hospitals, schools. His hands had designed places where lives would unfold, where moments of joy and sorrow would be lived out in the walls he had created. But now, his hands, calloused and scarred by the years, could only clutch this folder, a symbol of all he had lost. He wasn't just a man without a job. He was a father without a home, a husband who had buried his wife months ago, and a man who had no place in the world anymore. The streets of Chicago, once full of potential, had become a mirror of his soul. Empty, cold, unforgiving. His boots, worn down by the years, had long since stopped keeping out the cold. He could feel the dampness creeping up through them, biting at his feet with every step. He pulled the collar of his fraying jacket tighter around his neck, trying to shield himself from the wind that seemed to cut through him, through his very core. He wasn't sure if it was the cold air or the weight of the past that made him shiver more. The quiet isolation of this moment, the fact that he was standing at this bus stop with nowhere to go, no one waiting for him, felt heavier than anything he had experienced before. The red glow of a nearby pharmacy sign blinked on and off, reading 8:41 p.m. The bus was late. It was always late. Not that it mattered. John had nowhere to be. The thought landed on him with a quiet heaviness, like the snow piling up at his feet. This was it, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice, nothing more than a bus. Stop in the middle of winter, waiting for a ride that never came. There was no warmth in the world, only a slow creeping cold that seemed to find its way into every corner of his life. Then, through the thickening snowfall, she appeared. At first, he thought she was just another face, another hurried frozen soul trying to make her way through the unyielding city. But there was something about her that made him pause. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a business skirt and blouse, with heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She was beautiful, polished, composed, but it was immediately clear that she wasn't prepared for the cold. Her hair was wet from the falling snow, clinging to her face like strands of glass. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, trying to preserve warmth where none existed. She stopped beneath the same flickering street lamp as John, her breath coming in short, visible bursts. For a moment, John tried not to stare, but her presence was undeniable. She was striking, almost surreal against the bleak backdrop of the snow-covered street. Everything about her, her crisp clothes, her delicate posture, the vulnerability in the way she rubbed her bare hands together, made him realize how different their worlds were. She was out of place here, just as he felt out of place in his own life. The cold wasn't just physical for either of them. It was something deeper, something unspoken, something that lingered between them as the wind howled around the corners of the street. John's instincts told him to turn away, to retreat into the silence of his own world, but there was something about her that kept him watching. He noticed the way she flinched when the wind picked up, curling inward as if trying to disappear from the bite of the air. Her vulnerability, so raw, so stark against her otherwise composed exterior, pulled at something inside of him. He couldn't ignore it. Without thinking, John took off his jacket. It wasn't much. It was worn, frayed at the edges, patched with the same hands that had once built grand buildings. But it was the only thing he had left to give. His chest tightened with the act, but he didn't hesitate. He walked over to her, offering the jacket, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice shaking as much from the cold as from the surprise of his gesture. John gave her a faint, tired smile. "I've already lost enough today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This coat, it's the only thing I have left to give." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, her gaze lingering on the jacket. "But you need it more than I do," she protested, her voice barely audible in the howling wind. John shook his head, his smile a bit sad. "Not tonight," he said simply, wrapping the coat around her shoulders. "Not tonight." There was a warmth that spread between them, not just from the coat, but from the quiet comfort of his gesture. She pulled it tighter around her, the scent of soap and coffee mixing with the smell of the cold air. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was everything. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. John nodded, folding his arms to keep the cold out as he stepped back, allowing her to wrap herself in the coat. They stood there for a long while, the snow continuing to fall softly around them. The world felt still, as if even the universe had paused to witness this simple, quiet act of kindness. After a long silence, she turned to him. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice softer now, less guarded. "John," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. "I'm Rachel," she said with a small, grateful smile. "It's nice to meet you, Rachel," John said, his voice thick with the weight of the moment. She glanced at him again, her hand still wrapped around the coat. "You shouldn't have given me your jacket," she said, her tone conflicted. John smiled faintly, a weary chuckle escaping him. "Probably not," he said, "but I couldn't just let you freeze." A bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the snow and illuminating the street for a brief moment. Rachel moved toward it but stopped at the door, turning back to John. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked, her voice gentle. John shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Somewhere," he replied, his voice flat and empty, though his eyes betrayed a depth of unspoken truth. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just surviving. Rachel pulled a card from her purse, handing it to him. "In case you ever need anything," she said softly. John took the card, slipping it into his folder without looking at it. He didn't expect to use it. People said things like that all the time. Most of them didn't mean it. She stepped onto the bus and glanced back at him one last time before the doors closed behind her. The bus pulled away, disappearing into the falling snow. John stood there for a moment, staring at the bus as it vanished into the distance. Alone again. The cold gnawed at him, but not from the outside. It was something deeper this time. Something small and quiet, yet powerful. Something that felt like hope, unfamiliar but undeniable. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered to the night, and then turned to walk into the shadowed streets, unsure of what lay ahead, but carrying something with him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A tiny spark of something brighter than the cold. After their brief encounter, John couldn't shake the image of Rachel from his mind. As he sat in the small cold truck that had become his home, he found himself staring out the window, watching the flakes of snow fall with an almost hypnotic slowness. The weight of that simple gesture, the offer of his coat, settled on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had expected the cold to be the thing that would define this winter, but instead, it was the unexpected warmth of his small act of kindness that lingered. In the silence of the truck, John exhaled deeply, his breath fogging up the window. He was used to the quiet now, but tonight the stillness felt different. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to break the silence. The night he had shared with Rachel had been a fleeting moment, but it had stirred something inside of him. He wondered if he could still matter to someone, if his existence still held any significance. In his mind, he had convinced himself that his life was already on the edge of being forgotten, that he was a man defined by loss and failure. But Rachel had made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: recognition. She had seen him, not just as the man standing at the bus stop, but as someone capable of giving, even when he had little to give. The next few days were a blur of mundane routines, each day blending into the next with the same sense of unfulfilled purpose. John wandered from job fairs to free workshops, desperately trying to rebuild a life that felt like it was slipping further away with every passing hour. He stood in line after line, his hopes slowly being crushed by the weight of rejection. He tried not to let it show, tried to keep the mask of determination firmly in place, but there were moments when it cracked and the exhaustion bled through. He couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he had reached the end of a road that led nowhere. But something had changed since the night he met Rachel. It wasn't just the physical warmth of his coat now wrapped around her shoulders. It was the warmth of connection. He hadn't realized until later just how much he had been craving human contact. The kind that wasn't marred by pity or judgment. The kind that saw him for who he was. Not the man he had become, but the man he still was beneath the surface. Rachel had offered him that, even in the briefest of exchanges. He thought about her often in the days that followed. He wondered who she was behind the polished exterior, the sharp suit, the poised confidence. He wondered how a woman like her, someone so clearly successful, could stand at a bus stop in the middle of the night, cold and vulnerable, just like him. It was a curiosity he couldn't quite shake, a mystery that lingered in the back of his mind like a puzzle he couldn't solve. But life, as it always did, continued to move forward. He returned to the familiar grind, always just a step away from giving up. And then one evening, there was a knock on his truck door. Rachel stood there looking just as polished and composed as the night they met. But there was something different. In her eyes, a softness, a kind of quiet resolve that made John pause, unsure of what to say. She looked at him, her gaze steady, as if she had come with a purpose far beyond that brief, seemingly insignificant exchange at the bus stop. John didn't know what to expect. He couldn't even imagine why she was standing there in the bitter cold, looking as though she had come to offer him something that he couldn't fathom. For a moment he thought about closing the door, about retreating into the silence that had become his refuge, but something held him there. Something told him this moment wasn't like the others. "John," Rachel said softly, her voice not quite a question but a statement. "I've been thinking about you." John's heart skipped a beat. "Why?" She smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "You gave me your jacket and I couldn't stop thinking about what that meant. Not just the coat, but you. The kind of person who still chooses to give, even when they have nothing left to give." She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "It's rare, John. It's rare to find someone who still believes in kindness when life has taken everything else." John felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't speak for a moment, his mind racing as he tried to understand what she was saying. Rachel had come all this way not to thank him but to understand something he had only just begun to grasp himself. She had come to see him not as a man defined by his failures, but as a man who still had something left to offer. "I don't understand," John finally said, his voice hoarse. Rachel took a deep breath. "I'm here because I believe you have something valuable, John. And I want to offer you a chance, something that could change both our lives." John blinked in confusion. "A chance?" "Yes," Rachel said, her voice steady and clear. "I want to offer you a job at Infinity Group." John's heart stopped for a moment. "A job? What could I possibly do at a place like that?" "You can teach us about empathy," Rachel replied simply. "About kindness. About how to build something that's not just based on profit or growth but on people. I've created a new position. Someone who helps shape the culture of the company. Someone who can remind us all that there's more to success than numbers on a sheet." John stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up with her words. "But I don't have a degree. I haven't worked in years." Rachel smiled, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "You don't need a degree to teach people how to care. You've been living this every day, John. You know what it means to be overlooked, to be ignored, and still choose to give. That's the kind of leadership we need." John swallowed hard, his emotions swirling in a storm he couldn't control. He had spent so long believing that he was invisible, that his worth had vanished with everything he had lost. But Rachel was offering him something he couldn't have imagined, an opportunity to start again, to be seen for who he truly was, not what he had become. "I don't know," he said quietly, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "I don't think I'm what you need." Rachel stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You are. You're exactly what we need." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The snow continued to fall softly around them, the cold pressing in from all sides, but somehow it didn't seem as harsh anymore. There was something between them now, something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't just about the job or the coat or the fleeting moments of kindness they had shared. It was about something deeper, something that connected them both in a way neither had expected. Finally, John nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Rachel smiled, a look of quiet relief crossing her face. "Good," she said softly. "Because I believe in you, John." more than you know." As she turned to leave, John stood in the doorway, watching her walk away into the snowy night. Didn't understand everything that had just happened, but he felt something shift inside of him. A glimmer of hope. The faintest spark that perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't invisible after all. And for the first time in a long time, John felt the weight of his past lighten, if only just a little. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe this was the chance he had been waiting for. And as he stood there, the cold air wrapping around him once more, he couldn't help but believe that sometimes kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. The days after their encounter were a blur of restlessness for John. He woke up every morning in the same truck, tucked away behind the same old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, with the same feeling of uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. The fleeting warmth of his encounter with Rachel had started to fade, replaced by the reality of his life. A life that seemed stuck in the same place, unable to move forward. Yet something about the brief moment they had shared kept him awake at night. The words she had said to him, the look in her eyes haunted him. It wasn't just the kindness she had shown him. It was the offer she had made. A chance. A real chance. John had never expected anything like it. He had spent so long in survival mode, picking up the broken pieces of his life after losing everything, that the idea of an opportunity like this felt too good to be true. Infinity Group, a company that in his mind had always seemed far out of reach. He wasn't qualified, he wasn't prepared, and he didn't even know if he could live up to what Rachel was asking. But there it was, an offer that seemed to shine through the cracks of his existence like a distant star. Rachel's face appeared in his thoughts daily. She had come to him not out of pity, but out of a belief in him. A belief he didn't have in himself. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't ignore the pull, the strange, inexplicable sense of possibility she had ignited within him. But it wasn't just a job offer that lingered in his mind. It was her. The way she had seen him, not as a homeless man, a failure or a statistic, but as a person. The small act of kindness had sparked something in her, something she hadn't realized she was missing until their paths crossed. And now she was offering him a path out of the shadows. Still, doubt clawed at him. He was used to being overlooked, to being invisible in a world that had moved on without him. He knew the truth of his situation. He was a man without a place, a job, or even a roof to call his own. The thought of stepping into a world so far removed from his own, of sitting in boardrooms, speaking in front of people who had everything he had lost, made his stomach churn. How could he belong there? What did he have to offer that they couldn't get from someone with a degree, with experience? Rachel's offer had been generous, but it also felt like a trap. Could he really leave behind the life he had known, the brokenness that had become his identity? Could he trust that the kindness she had shown him wasn't a fleeting thing, that it wasn't just an act of charity that would soon be forgotten? These were the questions that plagued him as he walked through the days, uncertain of what to do next. It was only when he went to the job fair a few days later that he realized how much he was still carrying with him. The long lines of hopeful faces, the impersonal conversations with recruiters, the promises of potential. Everything felt like a repetition of his past. He was just another man in a sea of people who were all searching for the same thing. A way out, a way to be seen, to be noticed. But for all his effort, for all the time he spent crafting resumes and rehearsing answers to questions he didn't know how to answer, John couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever change. That night, after another discouraging day, John found himself sitting in his truck, his head leaning against the cold window. The city outside was alive, but he felt more disconnected than ever. He thought about Rachel. He thought about her strength, her confidence, the way she had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. The offer she had made to him seemed so far out of reach. Yet it stayed with him like a soft whisper that wouldn't let him rest. He pulled the card she had given him from his jacket pocket and stared at it. It was just a piece of paper, nothing more than a contact number. But to John, it felt like something much bigger. It felt like the bridge between the life he had been living and the one he had yet to imagine. A chance to start over. A chance to finally leave behind the weight of his past. But could he take that chance? Could he risk believing that there was something more for him out there? He had lived so long with the constant pressure of survival, of just getting by, that the idea of truly thriving felt almost foreign. But Rachel had shown him a glimpse of something different. She had seen him, not for what he had lost, but for what he could still give. Could he find the courage to believe in himself the way she believed in him? The days passed slowly, and the gnawing doubt inside him didn't subside. But the thought of Rachel's offer, of the warmth of her words and the way she had looked at him, kept pushing him forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of internal struggle, John made the decision. He would call her. He would take the leap. He would trust that the life he had been waiting for wasn't a fantasy. It was real, and it was waiting for him to step into it. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number on the card. His heart was racing, a mixture of hope and fear flooding his chest. When the phone rang, it felt like an eternity before Rachel answered. "Hello?" Her voice was calm, but there was a note of curiosity in it, as if she had been waiting for this call just as much as he had. "It's John," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, and then softly, "John, I'm glad you called. John paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about your offer, about what you said, about the chance you gave me." Rachel's voice softened, a note of understanding in her words. "You don't have to explain yourself, John. I believe in you. I've seen the kind of person you are, and I know you're capable of more than you think." John swallowed hard. He hadn't realized just how much he had needed to hear those words. "I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I can do this." "You don't have to be ready," Rachel said gently. "You just have to take the first step. The rest will come. I believe in you." The words hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time in years, John felt something shift inside him. He had spent so long waiting for the world to give him something, anything, that he hadn't realized he was the one who needed to take the first step. The offer Rachel had made wasn't just about a job. It was about trusting himself again, about having the courage to believe that he could be more than just the man standing at the bus stop in the cold. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I'm ready to try." Rachel's voice was warm and relieved. "Good, I'll see you soon." As he hung up the phone, John sat there in the silence of his truck, feeling something rise up in him. It wasn't just hope. It was a sense of possibility, something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. And as he stepped out of the truck and into the cold night, he felt a small spark inside him, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where he was no longer invisible. A chapter where he could finally truly begin again. The weeks following John's decision were nothing short of transformative. Every morning, when he woke in the truck, he could feel the weight of the decision pressing against him. But there was also a flicker of something new, something unfamiliar but undeniable. It wasn't the certainty he had expected, nor was it the relief of having everything figured out. No, it was something deeper. It was the quiet but persistent pull of possibility. He had made a choice. He had stepped into a life that was waiting for him, even if he didn't fully understand what it would become. The first day he arrived at Infinity Group felt like stepping into another world. Everything about the company was polished, gleaming. Surfaces, high ceilings, and people in crisp suits moving with purpose. It felt like a dream, one that he wasn't sure he could belong to. He had spent so long in the shadows, on the outside looking in, that the very idea of sitting in boardrooms, talking about strategies, and being a part of something so much larger than himself felt like an impossible leap. But Rachel had been insistent. She believed in him. And that belief began to stir something inside of him. An ember that, though small, could grow into a fire if given the chance. Rachel had created this position for him, a role that seemed almost too good to be true. Not because it was prestigious or well paid, but because it was a role that asked for something real, something human. She needed him not as an expert in business, but as someone who could bring empathy, understanding, and compassion into the heart of the company. It was a role that wasn't about numbers or spreadsheets. It was about people. John sat at his desk on the first morning, staring at the blank page in front of him. There was no instruction manual for this job, no list of tasks to check off. It was just him, and the expectation to bring something of value to a place that had everything, except the very thing that John had in abundance: empathy. He didn't know where to start. He felt like an imposter, like he was playing a part he wasn't ready for. The towering office buildings and the confident voices of executives around him only amplified his self-doubt. But there was something else, something small but persistent, that told him to keep going. So he did. Every day he listened. He listened to the people around him, his colleagues, the interns, the department heads. They talked about work, about deadlines and numbers. But underneath it all, John could hear the tension in their voices, the exhaustion in their eyes. He began to understand something that Rachel had seen from the very beginning. Success, when it is built only on numbers, is hollow. The first week passed in a blur. John spent most of his time in silence, observing how things worked. He didn't want to step on anyone's toes. And frankly, he wasn't sure if he had anything to say that would matter. But the more he listened, the more he began to see the cracks. People were so caught up in their roles, in their deadlines, in their endless pursuit of success that they had forgotten the most important thing, each other. No one was asking the tough questions. No one was taking the time to really see the people around them, to understand what they were going through. John wasn't an expert in business or corporate strategies, but he was an expert in people. He understood what it meant to be invisible, to be overlooked. He knew what it felt like to be seen as just another cog in the machine. And in those first few days, he realized that this was his place in the company. Not to fix problems or make money, but to remind people of the humanity that was so easily forgotten in the rush of corporate life. One afternoon during lunch, a young intern came to him. Her name was Sarah, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her shoulders hunched in exhaustion. She sat down next to John without a word, simply staring down at her lunch. John didn't say anything at first. He just sat with her in silence, understanding that sometimes words weren't needed. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know I should be more focused. I should be working harder, but I'm just so tired." John nodded, his eyes softening. "I get it," he said quietly. "You're doing your best. But sometimes being tired doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you've cared for too long without someone caring back." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "I've been working so hard, but it never seems to be enough. No one notices. I feel like I'm just another face in the crowd." John smiled gently, his voice firm but kind. "You're not just a face, Sarah. You're a person. And you matter. Don't forget that." For the first time that week, Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes. It was as though the weight of the world had been lifted, if only for a moment. She nodded slowly, as if she had been reminded of something she had forgotten in the hustle of her work. That moment marked a shift in John. It wasn't about solving everyone's problems. It was about being there for them, showing up when no one else did. The more he interacted with his colleagues, the more he saw how deep the exhaustion, the isolation ran. They didn't need more tasks or more pressure. They needed to be seen, to be heard. They needed kindness. And John, with his quiet wisdom and his own experience of loss and struggle, was the person who could remind them of that. Rachel had been right all along. He didn't need to be a polished executive to make a difference. He didn't need to have all the answers or be the smartest person in the room. What he needed was to be himself, the man who had nothing but still gave everything he had. The man who knew what it was like to feel invisible, and who could teach others that the most important thing was not to be forgotten. The weeks passed, and slowly John became a fixture in the company, though not in the way he had imagined. He wasn't the head of a department, he wasn't running projects, but he was something even more valuable. He was a reminder of what it meant to be human. People began seeking him out, not to solve their business problems, but to talk, to share their struggles, their doubts, their fears. And in turn, John listened. He didn't offer advice or solutions, not in the way that others might have. He simply listened and reminded them that it was okay to not have it all together. As time went on, the culture of Infinity Group began to shift. It was subtle at first, but it was real. Employees began to feel like they mattered, like they weren't just working for the company, but that the company was working for them too. The atmosphere in the office changed as people became more open with one another. There was a sense of relief, a collective exhale, as if the pressure had been lifted just enough to allow space for something new to grow. Rachel noticed the changes too. She watched as John moved through the office, quietly transforming the way people interacted with one another. She saw how the environment shifted from one of cold efficiency to one of genuine connection. And for the first time in a long time, she began to believe that the company she had built could be about more than just profits. It could be about people too. One day after a meeting, Rachel walked up to John. He was sitting at his desk, his eyes scanning through emails, but there was a softness to his posture that made him seem more at ease than before. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly," she said, her voice sincere. "You've done more for this company than I ever could have imagined." John looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the quiet humility that had become a part of him. "I'm just doing my job," he said quietly, trying to remind people that they matter. Rachel smiled, a small but powerful gesture. "You've done more than that. You've reminded me too." And in that moment, John realized that he wasn't just building a new life for himself. He was helping to build something greater. Something that was about more than just work, more than just survival. It was about connection. It was about kindness. And it was about finding a way to make the world a little bit better, one person at a time. As John walked out of the building that evening, he looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, shining through the darkening sky. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was exactly where he needed to be. He had found his place, not in a boardroom, not in a job title, but in the lives of the people around him. He was seen, he mattered, and that was all he needed. The days seemed to stretch out like a slow, deliberate unveiling. For John, it wasn't just about the work at Infinity Group or the interactions with colleagues. It wasn't even about the small victories that came with each day, though those mattered too. What had begun as an unlikely job offer had turned into something deeper, something far more significant than he had ever imagined. It had become a journey of rediscovery, not just for him, but for everyone around him. In the weeks since he had accepted Rachel's offer, things had changed. They had changed in ways that were almost imperceptible at first, like the subtle shift in the air before a storm, and then suddenly, all at once, they became undeniable. The company, which had once been a place where people worked hard for the bottom line, was now becoming something more. A place where people mattered. John hadn't planned for any of this to happen. He had only wanted to help. But in helping others find their humanity, he had found his own. As he walked through the halls of Infinity Group, he began to notice something new. The atmosphere had lightened. People who had once seemed like distant, faceless co-workers were now stopping by his desk, lingering to talk, to share something personal. They were talking about more than just deadlines or reports. They were talking about themselves, about the struggles they faced, the exhaustion they hid behind smiles, the fears they carried with them every day. And John, for the first time in years, felt like he had a place in all of it. He wasn't the one who had the answers. He wasn't there to fix anyone. He was there to listen. And it turned out that was all many of his colleagues needed. To be seen, to be heard, to be reminded that their struggles didn't make them weak, that it was okay to be vulnerable, to admit that things weren't perfect, that they were just doing the best they could. It wasn't a dramatic change, but a steady, quiet transformation. Slowly, the people around John began to shift too. They began to see their work not just as a job, but as a part of something greater. A place where they could be themselves, where their well-being mattered as much as the bottom line. And as they began to open up, to share their fears and hopes, they brought that new energy back into their work. The office wasn't just a space to go through the motions anymore. It became a place where collaboration wasn't just about completing tasks. It was about supporting one another. One afternoon, as John sat at his desk, a knock at his door startled him. He looked up to find Rachel standing there, a small smile on her face, her eyes reflecting a warmth he had come to recognize. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Of course," John said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Rachel took a seat, her posture relaxed but purposeful. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide how to phrase what she had been thinking. "You've been here a few months now," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I've been watching the changes, John. I've seen how you've impacted this place. It's not just the people you've helped, it's the way the entire atmosphere has shifted. You've done something here that I didn't even know was possible." John looked at her, his heart suddenly heavy. "I don't know if I've done anything. I'm just listening. I'm not fixing anything." Rachel smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a kind of deep understanding. "That's the point, John. You don't need to fix anything. People aren't broken. They just need to be seen. They need to feel like what they do matters, and that they matter. And you've reminded everyone here of that. You've given them the courage to open up, to care, and to bring their whole selves to work. That's a kind of leadership that's rare." John felt the weight of her words settle over him. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that, how much he had needed someone to recognize the subtle, quiet impact he was having, not just on the company, but on himself as well. "You've built something here, Rachel," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something that's not just about profits or growth. It's about people, about kindness. I didn't expect any of this, but I'm grateful for it, more than you know." Rachel's eyes softened and she nodded slowly. "You don't need to thank me, John. You're the one who's made this change possible. I can't even begin to explain how much it means to me that you're here." The silence between them was comfortable, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. John knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He had built a life from the ground up, one that was shaky and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, he was no longer walking it alone. He had found a place in this world, not as a man defined by his failures, but as a man who had something real to offer. Over time, the changes in John weren't just reflected in the atmosphere of Infinity Group, they were reflected in his own life too. He found himself returning home to the small apartment he'd rented with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The apartment was modest, but it was his. It was a place where he could sit quietly at night, thinking about how far he had come. He had a job he loved, people who respected him, and, most importantly, he had his son back. Noah had come to stay with him, and their evenings were filled with small moments of joy that John never thought he would experience again. A simple dinner, watching a movie together, or just talking about their day. It was enough. It was more than enough. John was no longer the man who had nothing to give. He had a future that wasn't built on the past, but on the possibility of something better, something more meaningful. And he knew deep down that he wasn't alone in this. Rachel had shown him what it meant to have faith in himself and in the people around him. She had given him a chance, but more than that, she had given him the opportunity to give back, to be a part of something bigger than himself. He was no longer just an observer in his own life. He was living it, fully. And that was all he had ever wanted. One night, as he sat on the couch in his apartment, Noah beside him, watching an old movie they had both seen 1,000 times, John realized something profound. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. And it wasn't because he had everything he once dreamed of. It was because he had finally found what mattered, what truly mattered. It wasn't the job, the apartment, or the accolades that would come. It was the people he had touched. It was the kindness he had shown and received. It was the recognition that he was more than the sum of his past mistakes. He was a father. He was a man who had found his way back from the edge of despair. He was someone who had found love and purpose, not in possessions or titles, but in the simple act of showing up for others. And that, he realized, was enough. When he looked out the window that night, the city lights twinkling in the distance, he felt a peace he had never known. He had arrived at a place of understanding, about himself, about others, and about the power of human connection. This was his new beginning. And this time it wasn't a dream. It was real. John had finally found his way home. This story inspires us to believe that it's never too late to change the course of our lives. No matter how far we may have fallen, we always have the power to rise again. The kindness we show to others, no matter how insignificant it may seem, has the potential to transform both our world and ourselves. So let's remember that even the smallest acts of kindness can spark incredible change. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to bring more inspiring content, and we'd love to share more incredible journeys with you.